crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com, and today I'm here with a 6x6 paper pad tutorial. I'm going to be using most of a 6x6 paper pad, and by most I mean like there's maybe one sheet and some scraps left. So this is the Winter Dream paper pad from Recollections, which means you can get it at Michael's, and I just wanted to mix it up. I do a lot of Doodlebug 6x6 paper pads, but a lot of their paper pads are really similar, and so I feel like sometimes I wind up making a lot of the same type of cards. And I also wanted to maybe try something where you could pick up the paper pad in a store, like in a physical store, because I know that that works better for some people. For others, that might not be the preferred one, but I just wanted to mix it up. And when I went to Michael's, I was drawn to this paper pad. I thought it would be easy to use. I purchased the pad on like a Saturday and was completely done with it by a Tuesday. So like that also felt really good, that I just really enjoyed it so much that I could easily make all the cards and use it up. So with this particular paper pad, and one of the reasons I was drawn to it was there was this one sheet of paper where there were these 3x3 cutouts. And I knew, well, that would make, in this paper pad, it is single-sided. It has these like silver embossed accents. And there are 24 sheets of paper, but 12 designs, which means that there are like 2 of each paper. So I knew with those 3x3 cut-aparts, I could make 2 cards with each one. There are 4 of them on one sheet, so there's 8 of them in all. And that would be like 8 cards using those. So I knew it would help kind of jumpstart everything. And they were in such a way that I thought they made sense for cards. Sometimes the cut-aparts, even in the 6x6 paper pads, seem like they're geared more towards scrapbookers, which I always think is a bit bizarre because like a 6x6 paper pad is probably going to be used for cards and not scrapbooks, but I guess maybe people use it for Project Life or planners, or I honestly don't know. It's just like when I see a 6x6 paper pad, I think card making, personally. But there were also 2 other papers in the paper pad that I thought, like I wasn't quite sure how I was going to use them to make cards, so I'll address those as they come up. But I am getting started with the simple cards that use those 3x3 cut apart sheets. So this time, when I was making the cards, I decided to do more layering than I typically do. A lot of times I will just use the pattern papers and I won't add a lot of cardstock. And that's in part because it can take a long time to make these videos and to use up a whole paper pad, especially when you add additional layers. But a lot of paper pads are 36 sheets and they're double-sided. This was 24 sheets and single-sided, so there was like less choices to make, and I felt like these cards were going to be a bit simple in some ways and would need something to sort of punch them up a bit. And so that's why I dug in my cardstock stash and I used papers like cardstock pieces that coordinated. I don't know the names of them. I don't have fancy cardstock that I keep track of in that way. It's just not my particular style. I also decided to complement this paper pad with 2 Lawn Fawn stamp sets. At first I wasn't sure if I'd use both, but I figured I might need some more embellishment towards the end, and so it would be great to pick out a stamp set that coordinated. So the first one that I'm using, and I use throughout the video, is the Merry Messages, and that's just a bunch of sentiments. So you could use whatever sentiment, Christmas sentiment stamp set that you have and you like and, fits on the cut-aparts, etc. And then I picked out the Critters in the Arctic stamp set from Lawn Fawn, and my thought process there was that this paper pad had lots of animals on it, and like Arctic animals. And so some of the animals that were featured in the paper pad were also in the stamp set. And so I thought they'd coordinate well together. So here I'm still working on my cut apart cards. I'm not going to talk through every single card because if you look at the still picture, it's pretty clear what I did, but I want to instead share more like tips for how to use up cards. And so one of the tips is if you feel like the papers aren't blending quite the way you want, like if you need something to make them pop a bit more, is adding that additional layer. And so here I used a stitched rectangle from Fawn. So that large rectangle that is featured on a lot of the cards is the largest of the smalls. And I am going to try to use scraps from one card on the very next card. And that way I'm not stuck with a pile of scraps at the end. So for instance, on the card that I'm working with right now, that animal pattern paper with animal in the trees, I used that on a previous card. And it wasn't quite long enough to fit on the current card, but that's okay because a big chunk of it was going to be covered by my sentiment. So what I did there was I just cut it partway through, like I cut part of where I knew it would be covered, and then I just glued it down with a gap. My gap will be then covered by my sentiment. Throughout the video, or the card making process, because it actually mostly happens at the end of the video, I add some extra embellishments. And the thought process there is that if I'm making a bunch of cards, I am sometimes trying to use up some things from my stash. We all have things that we tend to collect and then maybe don't think about using. But if we pick a pack of embellishments or a spool of ribbon, if it coordinates with one color if it coordinates with the paper pad, we can use it up and use a lot of it, versus if we were to just use it on a single card, because then the color scheme is going to change each time. So here, this particular cut apart had these silver embossed lines through it, which I really liked the silver embossing. It's one of the things that drew me to this paper pad, made it feel a little bit special. But I chose to stamp my sentiment in StazOn ink. Normally I would use VersaFine, but here I felt like the StazOn would stick to those silver parts. I don't know if it's necessary, but just a suggestion, if you feel like, or if you do get some smearing, try StazOn with that sort of shiny paper. So this particular piece of paper from the collection, I really liked. However, I knew it was going to be a little bit tricky to put on a card because I couldn't get all the animals on it unless I made a really big card. And so instead, I took my die cut and I chose what animals and the star, because I felt like, that's supposed to be the North Star. Although again, this is not realistic because a penguin and a polar bear were in the same scene, and penguins live the South Pole, polar bears live the North Pole. But this is card making, not science. So anyway, I framed it out with my die cut, which was another advantage of the die cut, is that I could control a little bit easier where I was cutting. Now, of course, you could just cut rectangles with your paper trimmer, but it actually will create, like when you cut it with a paper trimmer, it will create like two small thin chunks, as opposed to when you die cut it, those pieces are still connected, and it gives you just a teeny bit more versatility in terms of if you want to use the long strip at the top or the long strip at the side. I don't know if that quite makes sense, but you'll see it later in the video where, like, when I die cut out of a piece of 6x6 paper, in the bottom left corner, there's still like two chunks of cardstock left. Another challenging piece of pattern paper was this one here, and it has these sentiments on it even. So like that last one, I could cut it out, mat it, and then add a sentiment, and so it felt like I did something to the card. But here I'm like, I die cut a rectangle and I mounted it on another rectangle, and it could pretty much be a card. Like you could send it off that way. But I felt like, oh, I should really add something more to it. And so that's where I'm gonna do some snowflakes from the Merry Messages stamp set and some jewels here. And once I decided to pull out these Kaisercraft rhinestones, I knew that I would just use them on a bunch of the cards. However, I've made a lot of the cards already, so I'm going to go back at the end and add them. That also saves me a lot of time. Rather than finishing every single card start to finish in terms of like mounting them all on the cardstock or putting all the gems on, if I just create them and then go back and do that little bit of extra embellishment later, I can embellish a little bit faster. So I'll show you my process at the end. All right, so at this point, like one of the reasons that I was drawn to this paper pad, again, because I'm going to keep mentioning what I love about it, is that it had those birch trees and these cute animals, love critters, etc. And so I thought that that would be the point where I would start pulling out some of the critters to color. So if you are working with this paper pad and you don't have this stamp set, I don't think you need it. I think you can just go in your stash and find any woodland critters that appeal to you. I figure a lot of people have a set with some woodland critters. You know, maybe they're foxes you're used to coloring orange, but you're just going to color them white, or in this case, probably, you know, slightly gray so they look white. Or, you know, you can just kind of like mix up your animals. Like a deer, not meant to be in this winter scene, will still work. You can, you know, still make it look like the deers, or, yeah, etc. So again, I just encourage you to pick up whatever you like. I will share what Copic colors I used. All my products will always be linked in the video description just in case you're curious. This is the E7 group, E7774 and 71. Sorry that the caps were like totally covered in glare. I was like, I'm trying to be more mindful and show you them, but yeah, that light was hitting them in just the right spot. So for his antlers, I'm coloring in E37, 35, 33, and 31, which is like a lot of colors for a very small space, and you certainly don't need to use that many colors. Honestly, too, like you color with whatever color medium you have. I think watercolor would also look really beautiful with this paper pad because the animals in the paper pad have an almost watercolor feel to them. Like maybe that's how the artist created them. So I think that that would be a good option as well. And even coloring them solid would look great. Because one of the things that I'm striving to do when I create a bunch of cards with a 6x6 piece paper pad, is to create maybe a little bit quicker cards. Like these are not going to be my fanciest cards, but to put enough love and care into them that they are still appreciated and seem, you know, and are thoughtful. Like I'm not trying to create junky cards by any means, but, you know, just a little bit quicker. And I think that all of us sometimes wish we could be making cards just a little bit quicker during the holidays. So hopefully this shows you some ideas for a mix of quicker cards. And then here, like when I'm coloring these critters, it's going to go a little slower. I do, again, also have to color 2 of each critter because I'm making 2 of each card. So I'm not showing both cards each time, but they are there. In order to make the bunny look like an Arctic bunny and for the owl to look like a snowy owl, I want them to be white, but if you just leave them plain white, they look so flat. So I'm going to choose my C's. A lot of times I hear a recommendation for W's for critters because it adds some warmth to them, but in the case of Arctic animals, I think that the C's are probably the better choice. Either one, of course, is fine. So I used C3, 1, and 0. I added some drop shadows, so his legs would cast shadows onto his body, or his scarf would cast shadows onto his body. And for the scarf, I used BG 75 and 72 because I thought those two coordinated well with the paper pad. And then I'm going to color the snowy owl, and again go back to those C markers. I'm only going to use C1 and C0. If you look at pictures of snowy owls, they are very bright white, but they actually have a lot of detail all over their body in terms of those little black lines. So the Lawn Fawn stamp set puts the little black lines on his belly, but when you look at a picture of a snowy owl, they are all over his wings and the top of his head there. And you don't have to color, so I'm going to add those lines because I want to, I thought it would look nice. You certainly don't have to. I'm going in with the C7 marker for the beak because they essentially have a black beak. And then I'm going to place these little lines all throughout the top of his head and his wing. It was a little hard to get it exactly how I wanted to on camera because I kind of wanted to put my head like right next to it. So I did change them up a little bit after I wasn't coloring on camera, but I felt like those lines made it look realistic, or I don't know, more realistic. It's still a cartoon. So anyway, another thing I wanted to mention about like sort of the keeping it simple idea is I could have tried to stamp a sentiment from the Merry Messages stamp set, but some of them are quite big and long. I wanted a smaller sentiment, so having this additional stamp set helped me helped me to have some more choices. So the Let It Snow is from the Critters in the Arctic stamp set, just like all of the critters are from it. I'm going to create a little banner. I am going to try to keep this card pretty simple because the background was kind of already created for me, but another thing about bringing in the Critters in the Arctic stamp set is I also have a few more snowflakes to work with, but I am still trying to keep some things kind of simple in order to speed up the process of creating all these cards, because here I'm creating 24 cards over a couple of hours over a couple of days. Because like I know some people can sit down and just craft for like 8 hours and bang out all these cards, but that's just not my style. I get distracted. Anyway, the simplification of it is keeping those limited stamp sets, keeping them out on my desk, not having to put them away, which I know not everyone has the advantages of. Also, using one color of ink. I picked the Paris Dusk Memento ink. Part of the reason I picked it is because, again, it's one of those things that's like typically you can get even in a Michael's or like a local hobby store. So if you don't have access to some online shops, it's still like a choice you can have. But any ink that you want will do. And I thought this blue coordinated well, but also popped out a bit. It didn't blend in too much with the background. I think you could use black with this paper pad. And so if that's what you have, if you're not the kind of person who has a bunch of colored inks yet, that still works fine. So I knew that once I cut out that birch tree pattern for the moose, I would have a strip left. And so that's why I picked out the owl in the first place. Like I knew I would want to use the owl on the other birch tree card. And he looks a little funny compared to the birch trees. Like he looks like he's too big to be sitting on them. So instead, I had him sit on the sentiment. So I used the same Let It Snow sentiment, and I am just going to pop him up on top of that instead. When I pop things up with dimension, and again, those of you who have watched my channel for a while, you've heard me say this like a billion times, and you're going to probably say it with me. You'll know so much that I say it. I don't use foam tape. I just use scraps of cardstock layered double. So rather than having to purchase some additional foam tape, I'm just using my scraps of cardstock, layering them up, and it gives it just like this really thin popped up look, which I personally really like. So I wanted to add a bit more to this card because it says Let It Snow, and it's the same thing with the moose card. It said Let It Snow, but there's not really a lot of snowflakes on it, so I wanted to add some snowflakes. So I took the same blue ink that I've been using the whole time, stamped some snowflakes. I had already adhered down that banner, and I'd already adhered down that die cut. So when I went to stamp the snowflakes, I knew I still wanted them to be stamped off the edge because that just like looks better for movement around the card. But I didn't want to ruin the card, so I was just using that Post-it by placing it on the edge and using it as kind of like a way of masking off the rest of my card. I'm also returning to the polar bear. So with the owl, or I guess with the birch trees, I had an idea. I knew I was going to put the owl on the birch trees. I didn't know what I was going to do with this strip with the polar bear, but I knew it should be like a pretty prominent part of a card. It's still really interesting. It has those like silver stars all over the sky. It has the cute mama and baby polar bear. So I got to the point where I was like, okay, I got to figure out how I'm going to use this scrap. And what I decided to do was to create a cardstock background, because at this point, all of the pattern papers that were still 6x6, that were sort of left at this point as I'm dwindling down the papers, just were really competing with that strip of paper. I could have cut a banner with these. As you see, I use banners a lot when I am making 6x6 paper pad cards. It just, adds a bit of interest. It's really easy to do. But here, I felt like if I cut a banner, it would be cut into the iceberg, and I didn't really like that idea. So instead, to add more interest, I picked out a second piece of pattern paper that was in a strip. So these are the strips that are left over when you die cut out that stitched rectangle that I've used for so many of the cards. And I did it again here. I die cut a stitched rectangle out of this solid piece of blue paper. And then I'm layering it on another sort of light gray paper. So cardstock certainly, adding those extra colors of cardstock certainly came in handy. And another sort of like mass production tip, like I just pulled out a whole stack of cardstock that I thought coordinated and left it in a pile on my desk. So that way, when I was crafting with these, I didn't have to think. Like every time I went to make a new one, okay, I need to go find a navy piece of cardstock or a gray piece of cardstock. I was just like, okay, what in this pile works? So at this point, I have created quite a few cards. I'm getting really low on the papers that are left inside of the paper pad. And I'm dealing with this large piece that I knew when I bought the paper pad was going to be a challenge. I was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this because it's this like 6x6 square. And maybe if there was something on the inside, I could have cut that up and used it, or I could have made like a giant 6.5 by 6.5 card with like all kinds of critters in it. And you know what? Hey, like maybe that's the great idea. I still have a piece of pattern paper like that. So something that I actually legitimately would consider doing is making a really giant card with a whole bunch of critters in it. But in terms of this video, I didn't think that really kind of fit the style of what I was doing or was necessarily realistic. So here I've cut this big 6x6 down to these 3x3 squares. And I'm not sure, even in retrospect, I'm like, do I like it? In the end, I do. But it was like this weird shape that I created. And so I mounted that 3x3 on the same blue cardstock that I mounted the background paper on. And so again, that background paper is cut with the stitched rectangle die just for a little bit of interest. You could totally just cut it plain and leave a mat around it. And that stripe paper was another one that I was like, what am I going to do with these big bold stripes? Because in particular, the sentiments, I think it's like the top two, there's sentiments that go it's the top and bottom. There's sentiments that go right across the 6x6 paper, and they are 6-inch long sentiments. So if I cut that paper less than 6 inches, you're not going to be able to read the sentiment anymore. It's going to be cut off. And so I was like, I don't know what to do with that. I just trimmed a little off the bottom, ignoring the sentiments to make that other card. Now here, I am again, like at the sort of end. I don't have any more big pieces of paper other than the stripe and that big square thing. But I do have these strips of paper that are 2 inches wide. So if I put two of them together, it creates a 4-inch piece of like paper. And so I could make it look like I still have this big rectangle of paper to work with, but really it's just two little strips taped together. And so the problem with that is if I just glue them like that, like obviously it's not one piece of paper. But if I cover it with another strip of paper, which is this like light blue other animal strip, if I cover it, then I cover the seam and it looks more like a single piece of paper. So that's my recommendation. When you're like towards the end of a paper pad and you have a lot of these strips left that are still of significant size, you can combine them to look like you still have a big chunk of paper. And so I took the flower paper and the animal paper and layered the other animal paper on both of them. And then I'm able to cut it down to the more of the sort of standard card size. And I'm trimming it a little bit unevenly just so that like I kind of like where everything falls on the pattern paper. There is the word joy on there, but I just didn't feel like it worked as a sentiment, especially because the one on the left, which is a little hard to see, but I actually cut off the joy accidentally a little bit. So instead, I'm going to go to one of my pieces of scrap cardstock that I've created at some point along the way, because again, there's a pile of scraps that I'm pulling from. There's a pile of cardstock on my desk that I'm pulling from, and I'm just leaving it all there throughout the process so that I'm just like, I need something of about this size. Is there anything in this pile? So I'm not cutting into a new piece of cardstock or anything like that. So I stamped another sentiment. This is back to the Merry Messages stamp set. Like, again, I realize you can't buy Lawn Fawn at Michael's where you bought the paper pad, but you probably have some kind of sentiment stamp set. They had a lot of great sets at Michael's. I just already have so many. I didn't feel the need to buy a new set just for this video. And I hope this encourages you to look in your stash and combine something that you already own with something new and fun. Because like I loved getting a new paper pad, but I wouldn't have wanted to buy everything new to make a set of Christmas cards. Just don't have the budget for it. You know what I mean? So anyway, I decide, well, unfortunately, I need to mount this sentiment banner that I've created. And so I've done that with some light blue cardstock, and I have 2 more cards that I've created, again, completely with scraps. So here's what's left of my paper pad at this point. I believe at this point, I have made 22 cards. And so I don't feel bad. Like if I threw all of that out, it would be fine because I've made so many cards with this $5 paper pad. And I don't even think I paid $5 for it because you can get those on sale or use a coupon, et cetera, et cetera. Honestly, I probably wouldn't throw them out. I'd find someone to donate to them, give it to my kids or your grandkids, whoever. Give it. Well, I don't have kids. I met my kids at school. I would give it to somebody, or I'd put it in a scrap bin or something. For now. But I thought I bet you I can figure out something to do with these because this paper is so cute. I mean, I really genuinely like it. I just, you have to make it 6 inches long. So what I decided to do was make a 4.25 by 6 inch card. And I was just going to trim down that paper and glue it on top. And I realized that's kind of a boring card. I literally just glued pattern paper to a card base. But the pattern paper itself is so well designed and pretty, I think it's okay. So sorry if that wasn't very inspiring, but there we go. So I had used some ribbon earlier, but I was only a little bit of scrap of ribbon. So I was very happy to kind of just use that up in this card making process. But I pulled out these rhinestones before and I told you I'd get back to them. And so I had a couple packs of these rhinestones that essentially I found at a thrift store for like nothing. Very, very cheap. And I can't resist that. Like I've bought like gemstones at Michael's or wherever for like 10 cents a pack. And so I wind up with too many. I like stock up on them because they're so cheap when they go on these crazy clearances or whatever. But I was like, I got to use them. So here at the end, after I've created all the cards, I'm going to go back and add gems to them. And I noticed like one easy way to just use up a bunch of the gems was to place them in the scenes, like complement the snowflakes with them. Here I'm doing that. Or complement the stars in the sky. And those, there's like 2 cards where there's the star background, and just adding a few gems in there really helped kind of add a bit of shine, interest, made the card look a little fancier. I love sparkle and shine at Christmas time. I don't always use it. I'm not always a big gem person. In fact, I sometimes really like having cards that are fully recyclable because I think, in the end, that's probably better for when people are done enjoying your cards, if they can just toss them in the recycling, which I know pains some people to hear that's what happens to their card. Also, on camera, I'm mostly just doing one of the 2 cards because I'm trying to make it quick for you. But I'm going to go back and add gems to both of the exact same cards in similar spots. What was nice about being able to mix it in with the stars is it gave me an excuse to use the bigger and smaller gems. So some cards I felt like really needed small gems, and other cards I could use whatever size gem I needed to get rid of or like use up. So that worked out really well. Like here on this card, where to put the gems was like, to me, I'm like, well, there's these circles on top of the trees. I'll just replace it with gems. Or the center of the flowers was like an obvious spot. So I just kind of kept thinking about those little things, like how can I just really, really quickly use up some embellishments, make my cards feel just a bit more special. And so I just use those philosophies all throughout. So that's the end of my 24 cards, 1 6x6 paper pad tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. I will leave links to everything, including the paper pad. I'm not sure if it's available online. Still might be sold out. And I hope that some of the tips are helpful, even if you're not trying to recreate with this same paper pad. I know these videos are super long, but again, I think that a lot of people enjoy some of the tips and tricks I share in them. So I hope that was your experience today. Thank you so much for spending this much time with me. I really appreciate your time. If you could give this video a thumbs up, maybe in the comments, let me know what your favorite card was. And yeah, thanks so much for watching. Bye.